Lost Connections by Johann Hari. Picture this. A man stands on a dusty side street in Hanoi, Vietnam. Johann Hari is exhausted, hungry, and staring at the most unnaturally perfect red apple he's ever seen. He knows something's off about it. Too shiny, too flawless, but hunger wins. He takes a bite and immediately regrets it. The bitter, chemical taste floods his mouth, but he's too tired to care. He eats half and moves on. A few hours later, his body starts its rebellion. For 2 days, he's trapped in a hotel room, completely wiped out. On day 3, stubborn as ever, he drags himself out to work. He's sitting in the humble home of an 87-year-old Vietnamese woman, listening to her incredible story of surviving 9 years of American bombing, when suddenly the room starts spinning like a carnival ride from hell. His body explodes in waves of sickness. The old woman looks at him with those knowing eyes that have seen everything. "This boy needs to go to a hospital," she says matter-of-factly. "He is very sick." Next thing he knows, he's being rushed to a stark, Soviet-era hospital where doctors and nurses are shouting in Vietnamese while jabbing needles into his arm. And here's where it gets interesting. Even as the nausea overwhelms him, part of his brain stays eerily calm, thinking, "Oh, this is what dying feels like." Death by poisoned apple. He desperately begs for anti-nausea medication, but through his translator comes this message from the doctor: "You need your nausea." It is a message, and we must listen to the message. It will tell us what is wrong with you. They were absolutely right. His kidneys had shut down. He was severely dehydrated. That poisoned apple had nearly killed him, and if he'd silenced the message his body was screaming, he would have died. You need your pain. It is a message. This one sentence became the key that unlocked everything. Because, here's the thing, Johann had been dealing with a different kind of pain for years. Depression. And, like millions of us, he'd been sold a simple story. His pain was just a malfunction, a disease, a chemical imbalance in his brain. The solution? A little white pill he first swallowed at 18 years old. But after more than a decade on ever-increasing doses of antidepressants, he found himself facing a terrifying question. If he was supposedly taking the cure, why was he still drowning in pain? This question launched him on a 40,000-mile journey across the world to interview the leading scientists, uncovering the real causes of depression and anxiety. What he discovered is going to change everything you think you know about this epidemic of sadness sweeping our world. The book we're diving into today, Lost Connections, has sold millions of copies and been translated around the globe because it gives voice to something so many of us feel but can't quite put into words, that our pain isn't just in our heads. So for the next hour, I want to take you on that same journey. We're going to uncover the real story of why we feel the way we do. By the end, you'll understand that depression isn't a sign of weakness or a broken brain, but a profound and necessary signal. It's a message. And if we learn to listen to it, it can guide us back to a life of connection and meaning. Our story begins not in a lab, but on a beach in Barcelona, with an 18-year-old kid who couldn't stop crying. He'd just had his first real heartbreak, and for as long as he could remember, this had been his pattern. These sudden, overwhelming waves of sadness that would force him to hide from the world. He thought he was weak, that it was all in his head. But sitting there on that beach while his friend watched him fall apart, a thought struck him like lightning. I'm not weak, I'm depressed. This was Johann Hari, and that realization felt like liberation. Depression wasn't a personal failing. It was a medical condition, like diabetes. And if it was a medical condition, that meant there was a medical solution: antidepressants. When he got back to London, his doctor confirmed this comforting new belief. The doctor explained patiently that some people, through no fault of their own, have a chemical imbalance in their brains, not enough of a chemical called serotonin. Fortunately, this new generation of drugs called SSRIs could fix it. They could restore his brain to normal. It was such a simple, elegant story, and Johann embraced it completely. He walked out of that pharmacy and swallowed his first antidepressant, feeling like he'd received what he later called a chemical kiss. For years he became an evangelist for this story. At first, the pills seemed to work. He felt a surge of energy and resilience. But after a few months, the sadness would always creep back in, like fog rolling over a hill. Each time, he'd return to his doctor, and they'd agree he needed a higher dose. 20 milligrams became 30, then 40, then 60. He gained weight, he sweated constantly, but he believed it was a small price to keep the darkness at bay. He even wrote articles explaining that depression was a brain disease, and these drugs were the cure. But after 13 years, he had to face a brutal truth. No matter how high the dose, the sadness always outran it. He was doing everything he was told was right, yet he was still depressed. And looking around, he realized he wasn't alone. Western society had become absolutely saturated with these drugs. 1 in 5 American adults was on psychiatric medication. We were literally awash in antidepressants, so much so that they can actually be found in our drinking water. This led him to 2 huge mysteries. First, if these drugs were the solution, why were so many people who took them, like him, still depressed? And second, why were so many people becoming depressed and anxious in the first place? His search for answers began with a Harvard professor named Irving Kirsch. Now, Kirsch used to believe the same story as Johann. He prescribed antidepressants and told his patients they worked by correcting a chemical imbalance. But he was also a leading expert on something called the placebo effect. Let me take you back to the 1790s for a moment. There was this doctor named Johann Hari, who was completely baffled by a miracle cure sweeping the Western world. An American named Elisha Perkins had invented these thick metal rods called tractors, which he claimed could literally draw pain out of your body. And for many people it actually seemed to work. Dr. Hari was skeptical, so he ran an experiment. He created a fake tractor out of wood and disguised it. Then he used it on 5 patients who were crippled with chronic pain. 4 of them immediately felt, quote, remarkably relieved. One man who couldn't walk was suddenly striding around the room like he'd won the lottery. Haygarth had stumbled onto something profound. When you give someone a medical treatment, you're actually giving them 2 things. You're giving them the chemical, and you're giving them a story about what that chemical will do. The story, the expectation, the hope, what we now call the placebo effect, is incredibly powerful medicine all by itself. Back to the present day. Professor Kirsch and his graduate student decided to figure out exactly how much of the antidepressant effect came from the chemicals and how much came from the placebo effect. When they analyzed all the publicly available studies, they were shocked. The numbers showed that only 25% of the drug's effect was from the chemicals. A staggering 75% was the placebo effect and other factors. But here's where it gets really wild. Kirsch learned that drug companies are legally required to submit all their trial data to the FDA, even the studies where their drugs completely fail. However, they only tend to publish the studies that make their drugs look good. This is called, quote, publication bias. Using the Freedom of Information Act, Kirsch got his hands on all the data, the good, the bad, and the ugly. What he found was scandalous. In one trial for Prozac, The drug company had published results for only 27 of the 245 patients, just the ones the drug seemed to work for. When Kirsch analyzed the complete, unfiltered data for the most popular antidepressants, he discovered that the actual chemical effect was absolutely minuscule. Scientists measured depression on something called the Hamilton scale, which goes from 0 to 51. Just improving your sleep can move you 6 points on that scale. The chemical antidepressants? They created an improvement of just 1.8 points. This suggested the drugs were having almost no meaningful chemical effect for most people. The side effects, the weight gain, the sexual dysfunction, the sweating, were very real, caused by the chemicals. But the antidepressant effect was largely a story, a placebo. This discovery led Kirsch to an even bigger question. Where did the chemical imbalance story even come from? Johann dug into the history and learned that the theory was basically born by accident in 1952, when a drug for tuberculosis unexpectedly made patients euphoric and start dancing uncontrollably. A decade later, a scientist named Alec Koppen put forward a tentative hypothesis. What if these drugs work by increasing serotonin, and what if depression is caused by low serotonin? It was, as one scientist put it, at best a reductionist simplification, and they openly admitted it couldn't be proven with the data they had. But it was a great story. Simple, easy to grasp, perfect for marketing. When drug companies wanted to sell their new SSRIs, they took this unproven hypothesis and sold it to the world as established fact. Professor David Healy, one of the world's leading experts on these drugs, told Hari bluntly, there was never any basis for it, ever. It was just marketing copy. So if depression isn't a chemical imbalance, what is it? The first clue came from an unlikely place, the official rulebook for psychiatrists, the DSM. To be diagnosed with depression, you have to show at least 5 of 9 symptoms, like loss of pleasure or feelings of worthlessness. But the authors noticed a problem. Almost everyone grieving the death of a loved one meets the criteria for clinical depression. This made them uncomfortable. It seemed wrong to label a grieving person as mentally ill. So they created what they called the grief exception. It stated that you could show all the symptoms of depression and not be considered mentally ill, but only in one circumstance: if someone you love has recently died. Johann spoke with Professor Johann Hari, a specialist in traumatic grief, whose own daughter was stillborn. She explained that this exception reveals a deep contradiction. Why do we grieve? She asks. We grieve because we have loved. To pathologize grief is to insult love itself. But the grief exception raises an obvious question. If it's reasonable to have the symptoms of depression when you lose a loved one, why is that the only life event where it's considered a sane response? What if you lose your job and can't find another? What if you're trapped in a meaningless life you hate? What if you're profoundly lonely? This idea blows a hole in the purely biological story. It suggests that depression isn't just a malfunction in your head. It's a response to what's happening in your life. It's a form of grief. Grief for a person we've lost, yes. But maybe also grief for the connections we've all lost, but still desperately need. This brings us to the heart of the book, the 9 real causes of depression and anxiety. Johann Hari found that all of them are forms of disconnection. They're deep, unmet needs that our culture is getting worse and worse at fulfilling. The first cause is disconnection from meaningful work. Hari tells the story of Joe Phillips, a guy who worked in a paint shop. His entire day consisted of 3 steps. Take an order, put a can of paint in a machine that shakes it, say thank you, sir, then wait. And repeat. All day, every day. No one ever noticed if he did it well or badly. "I don't feel like I made a difference in anyone's life," he said. He felt like his human thoughts and feelings were basically a defect. He felt guilty for feeling this way, knowing others would kill for his job. But he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was pointless. He eventually turned to prescription painkillers just to numb himself enough to get through the workday. Joe's story isn't an anomaly. A global Gallup poll found that an incredible 87% of people are either not engaged or actively disengaged from their jobs. They're, in Gallup's words, sleepwalking through their workday. Sir Michael Marmot conducted a landmark study of British civil servants to understand how work affects our health. Everyone assumed the high-powered boss at the top would be the most stressed. But Marmot found the exact opposite. The lower you were in the hierarchy, the higher your risk of depression and heart disease. The key factor wasn't responsibility. It was control. The less control you have over your work, the more likely you are to become depressed. Meaningless, monotonous, disempowering work, Marmot concluded, is one of the most stressful experiences a human being can endure. The second cause is disconnection from other people. As a child, Johann moved with his parents to a London suburb where life happened entirely behind closed doors. His parents, who came from tight-knit communities, were completely baffled. "Where is everyone?" his mother would ask, looking out at the empty streets. This feeling of isolation has become a modern epidemic. The neuroscientist John Cacioppo dedicated his life to studying loneliness. In one experiment, he found that becoming acutely lonely is as stressful on your body as being physically attacked by a stranger. It causes your levels of the stress hormone cortisol to absolutely soar. He proved, through multiple studies, that loneliness isn't just a consequence of depression, it's a direct cause. Why is loneliness so painful? Because for 99% of human history, we lived in small, nomadic, hunter-gatherer tribes. Our survival depended entirely on cooperation. To be separated from the tribe was literally a death sentence, so we evolved this deep, biological need for a tribe, just as a bee needs a hive. Loneliness is an evolutionary signal, an alarm bell telling you to get back to the group. But in our modern world, we've systematically dismantled our tribes. Harvard professor Robert Putnam has documented a massive decline in all forms of collective activity over the past several decades. We bowl alone. We eat alone. A study found that in recent decades, the most common answer for Americans when asked how many close friends they could confide in during a crisis was 0. We think we've replaced this with online connection, but it's a parody of what we've lost. Hilary Kesh, who founded the first rehab center for internet addiction, says her patients are almost always anxious or depressed before their compulsive internet use begins. The online world offers a fantasy of connection, a team, a status, a tribe, to people who feel lost and isolated in the real world. But it's like junk food. It mimics the real thing, but never truly satisfies. The third cause of depression is disconnection from meaningful values. As a child, Johann, like so many of us, learned to believe that happiness meant buying things. He obsessively coveted toys he saw in commercials. This message is the wallpaper of our culture. Get the right grades, get the high-paying job, display your success through stuff. The psychologist Tim Kasser has spent his career scientifically testing this idea. He discovered that our motivations can be divided into two types. Intrinsic motives are things you do for their own sake, because they bring you joy and meaning, like learning an instrument or being a good friend. Extrinsic motives are things you do for an external reward, money, status, admiration. Our culture constantly pushes us toward extrinsic values. But Kasser's research has shown, again and again, that the more materialistic and extrinsically motivated you become, the more depressed and anxious you'll be. People who achieve their extrinsic goals, the promotion, the fancy car, experience no increase in day-to-day happiness. None. But people who achieve their intrinsic goals become significantly happier. Materialism is like fast food for the soul. It looks like it'll nourish you, but it's full of psychological toxins that leave you feeling sick and empty. It makes our relationships shallower, it robs us of moments of pure joy, and it leaves us in this constant state of anxious comparison, because there's always someone with more. We're being systematically trained to seek happiness in all the wrong places. The fourth cause is disconnection from childhood trauma. Dr. Vincent Felitti was running an obesity clinic in the 1980s. His program was incredibly successful at helping people lose weight, but he noticed something really strange. The patients who lost the most weight often became brutally depressed, panicked, and even suicidal. They'd flee the program and quickly regain all the weight. Baffled, he started actually listening to their stories. He asked one woman, who had gone from 408 pounds down to 132, why she'd started eating compulsively again. She said that when she was a healthy weight, a man had propositioned her, and she panicked. Dr. Felitti then asked a question no one had asked before. When did you start gaining weight? She was 11, she said. What else happened when you were 11? That, she replied, was when her grandfather began to rape her. Dr. Felitti discovered that over half the patients in his program had been sexually abused as children. Many were unconsciously using their obesity as a shield, a way to become invisible and protect themselves from male attention. He realized what we had perceived as the problem, major obesity, was in fact, very frequently, the solution. This led to the landmark Adverse Childhood Experiences study. 17,000 people were surveyed about 10 different types of childhood trauma. The results were staggering. For every category of trauma you experienced as a child, your risk of becoming depressed as an adult skyrocketed. Someone with 6 categories of childhood trauma was 5 times more likely to become depressed. The lesson is profound. So often we see depression as the fire, when it's actually the smoke. It's a response to a deeper hidden pain. To heal, we have to stop just trying to blow away the smoke and start addressing the fire inside. The fifth and sixth causes are closely related: disconnection from status and respect, and disconnection from a hopeful or secure future. The biologist Robert Sapolsky spent decades studying baboon troops on the African savannas. Baboons live in strict hierarchies. He found that the lower a baboon's rank, the higher its levels of stress hormones. A low-status baboon, constantly humiliated and attacked, behaves in a way that looks strikingly like a depressed human. It keeps its head down, loses its energy, and withdraws. Depression, some scientists believe, is partly an evolutionary submission response, a signal that says, I give up, don't attack me, I'm no threat. In our society, economic inequality creates vast status gaps. We're constantly bombarded with messages that only the rich and famous matter, creating this pervasive sense of inadequacy and humiliation for the vast majority. Research by Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson has shown a direct link. The more unequal a society is, the higher its rates of mental illness. This inequality feeds into the loss of a hopeful future. We are increasingly living in what's called a precariat, a class of people with no job security, no contract, and no ability to plan for the future. Johann tells the story of his friend Angela, a bright university graduate who found herself working in a call center where her shifts were determined week by week. and she was constantly afraid of being fired. She couldn't plan her life. She couldn't see a way out. It completely takes away any sense of identity, she said. This loss of a future, this feeling of being trapped in an eternal traffic jam, is a powerful driver of anxiety and despair. The seventh cause is disconnection from the natural world. When animals are taken out of their natural habitats and put in zoos, they often develop behaviors that look like extreme despair. Parrots rip out their own feathers. Elephants grind down their tusks. Isabelle Behenti, a biologist who studied bonobos in the Congo, noticed that in the wild, they get sad, but they never develop the, quote, full-blown chronic depression she saw in zoos. We're the only animals to have ever voluntarily removed ourselves from our natural habitat. We forget that we're animals, and our bodies and minds evolved to be in nature. Studies have shown that people who move to greener areas see a significant reduction in depression. Even having a view of trees from a prison cell makes inmates less likely to get sick. Being in nature does three things. It gets our bodies moving, which is a natural antidepressant. It satisfies an innate love for the landscapes we evolved in, a concept called biophilia, and it induces a feeling of awe, which shrinks our ego and makes our personal worries seem smaller and less important. Finally, Hari explores the biological factors, genes, and brain changes. Yes, there's a genetic component to depression. It accounts for about 37% of the risk, but a groundbreaking study found that even if you have the depression gene, you're no more likely to become depressed than anyone else, unless you experience a major stressful life event. Genes can make you more sensitive, but they don't determine your destiny. They're the gun, but the environment pulls the trigger. And yes, the brain of a depressed person looks different on a scan. But this is a consequence, not a cause. The brain isn't a fixed object. It's constantly changing in response to our experiences. This is called neuroplasticity. If you learn to drive a London taxi, the part of your brain related to spatial memory physically grows. In the same way, if you live a life of disconnection and trauma, your brain will adapt to that pain. The changes in your brain don't cause the depression. They're the physical manifestation of the depression. To understand the problem, you have to ask not what's inside your head, but what your head is inside of. So if these disconnections are the real causes of our pain, what are the real solutions? The journey for answers begins with a story from Cambodia. A group of doctors were treating a rice farmer who had lost his leg to a landmine and was consumed with despair. Instead of giving him pills, they sat with him. They listened. They realized his old job was causing him constant pain and stress. So they bought him a cow, so he could become a dairy farmer. His depression lifted. You see, doctor, they explained, the cow was an antidepressant. This is the central lesson of the second half of the book. A true antidepressant isn't just a pill. It's any action that helps us to reconnect. Hari outlines 7 forms of reconnection. The first is reconnecting to other people, and this is where we find one of the most powerful stories in the book. It takes place in Kati, a poor concrete housing project in Berlin, a place full of isolated, depressed people. One summer, a 63-year-old Turkish woman named Nuriye Cengiz, who was being evicted, put a sign in her window saying she was going to kill herself. That sign was a spark. Her neighbors, Turkish immigrants, left-wing punks, gay activists, people who had lived side by side for years without ever speaking, started to actually talk to each other. They realized Nuriye's problem was their problem. They were all facing eviction from rising rents. So they did something radical. They built a protest camp right in the middle of the main street and said they wouldn't leave until Nuriye could stay in her home and everyone's rent was frozen. They took shifts guarding the camp, day and night. Strangers became friends. A religious woman in a headscarf sat through the night with a punk woman covered in tattoos, sharing stories of being single mothers. A retired communist teacher started tutoring a Turkish teenager who was about to be expelled. The local gay bar, once viewed with suspicion, became the headquarters for the protest, providing food and a meeting space. They had found a common goal, a shared purpose. They were no longer isolated individuals suffering alone. They were a we. Sandy, one of the protesters, said the protest was like therapy for us. Nuri, who had been suicidal, became a leader, physically using her wheelchair to block other evictions. They had moved from disconnection to connection, and in doing so they found a way out of their despair. After a year of struggle, they won. Their rents were frozen. This is a beautiful story, but how can it be replicated? Hari takes us to a doctor's office in East London, where a program called Social Prescribing is changing lives. Lisa Cunningham had been a mental health nurse, but bullying at work sent her into a deep depression that lasted 7 years. She barely left her house. Her doctor didn't just give her pills. He prescribed her to a group of other depressed patients who were tasked with turning a neglected piece of wasteland into a community garden. At first, Lisa was terrified, but slowly, working together in the soil, the group began to heal. They weren't forced to talk about their pain. They had a shared, meaningful task to focus on. As the flowers bloomed, so did they. They were reconnecting with nature and with each other. Lisa stopped taking her medication, lost weight, and eventually opened her own gardening center. Social prescribing is about doctors having the humility to say they don't have all the answers, and that sometimes the best medicine is helping people find a community and a purpose. Another path is reconnecting to meaningful work. In Baltimore, a group of bike mechanics, led by Josh Mitchell, got tired of being treated like disposable cogs in a machine. Instead of just finding a new boss, they decided to get rid of the boss altogether. They started Baltimore Bicycle Works, a democratic cooperative where everyone is an owner, everyone has a say, and everyone shares in the profits. The day-to-day work is the same. They still fix bikes, but the feeling is completely different. They have control, they have respect, they have a secure future. Meredith, Josh's wife, used to have crippling anxiety on Sunday nights, dreading the work week. After joining the co-op, it vanished. They proved that you don't have to accept meaningless work. You can elect your boss and build a workplace that meets your human needs. Hari explores several other forms of reconnection. We can reconnect to meaningful values by creating groups, like those started by Nathan Dungan, that help us question the junk values of consumerism and align our lives with what truly matters. We can acknowledge and overcome childhood trauma through compassionate listening, as Dr. Felitti discovered. We can also use psychological tools to overcome our addiction to the self. Hari introduces sympathetic joy, a form of meditation where you actively practice feeling happy for other people's success. This works like a muscle, training the brain out of the toxic patterns of envy and comparison that fuel so much of our anxiety. This leads to a fascinating exploration of meditation and even psychedelics, which, under clinical conditions, have been shown to help people experience ego death, a temporary dissolution of the self that allows them to feel a profound sense of connection to others and the universe, leading to lasting reductions in depression and addiction. Finally, Hari argues we must restore a hopeful future. For this, he points to a radical experiment that took place in a small Canadian town called Dauphin in the 1970s. For 3 years, Every resident was given a guaranteed basic income, enough money to live on, with no strings attached. 30 years later, economist Evelyn Forget uncovered the forgotten data from the experiment. She found that during that period, hospitalizations for mental health problems dropped by 9%. People were less stressed, students stayed in school longer, and new mothers could afford to stay home with their babies. The security of a basic income acted as a powerful, community-wide antidepressant. Each of these reconnections is a piece of a larger puzzle. They show us that the solutions to our epidemic of despair are not found in a pill bottle. They're found in the world around us, and in the world we can build together. As we come to the end of this journey through lost connections, it's worth pausing and reflecting on the sheer power of the idea at its core. For decades, we've been told a story about our pain that is fundamentally disempowering. We've been told that our sadness is a glitch, a brain disease, something broken within us as individuals. This story has left millions of us feeling isolated, ashamed, and helpless, waiting for a chemical fix that, for most, never truly comes. What Johann Hari has done so masterfully is give us a new story, a story that's not only backed by a huge body of scientific evidence, but that's also deeply, intuitively true. It's a story that reclaims our pain. It tells us that our depression and anxiety are not a malfunction. They're a form of grief. They're a signal, a sane and rational response to living in a culture that's failing to meet our deepest psychological needs. This shift in perspective is revolutionary. If your pain is a message, then the goal is no longer to silence it, but to listen to it. What is this pain telling you that you need? Is it meaningful work? A community? A connection to nature? A sense of a secure future? Honoring our pain means looking for its sources not just in our brains, but in our lives and in our society. This can be a difficult truth to accept, because it means the solutions aren't simple. There's no quick fix. The path to reconnection requires effort, both from us as individuals and from us as a collective. It means challenging the junk values that have been sold to us our entire lives. It means fighting for workplaces where we're treated with dignity and respect. It means rebuilding our communities, one small act of connection at a time. But while this path is challenging, it's also profoundly hopeful. The old story left us as passive patients. This new story makes us active agents in our own healing. It tells us that we have the power to change our environment, and, in doing so, to change how we feel. The stories from Cody, from the garden in East London, from the Baltimore bike shop, they're not just inspiring anecdotes, they're blueprints. They show us that it's possible to build a world that's more connected, more meaningful, and less depressing. So what can you do with this, starting today? First, try a simple shift in mindset. The next time you feel a pang of sadness or anxiety, instead of asking, "What's wrong with me?" ask, "What am I missing? What need is not being met?" Let your pain be your guide. Second, practice a small act of reconnection. So much of our culture pushes us towards self-focus. Try to counteract that. When you feel low, instead of doing something for yourself, do something for someone else. It doesn't have to be big. Make a friend a cup of tea and truly listen to them. Help a stranger with their groceries. This small act of turning your attention outward can be a powerful antidote to the inward spiral of depression. Third, find your cow. For the Cambodian farmer, the cow was the antidepressant because it gave him a way back to a meaningful life. Your cow might not be a literal cow. It might be joining a group, volunteering for a cause you believe in, or starting a small project with your neighbors. The point is to find something outside of yourself that gives you a sense of shared purpose. That was a summary of Lost Connections by Johann Hari. We've explored the main ideas today, but a summary is like looking at a map of a beautiful country. The map is useful, It shows you the layout, but it can never replace the experience of actually walking the land yourself. The real power of this book is in the depth of the stories and the humanity of the people Johann meets along the way. This summary is a starting point, an invitation. If the ideas we've discussed have sparked something in you, I truly encourage you to read the book. It's not just about learning facts. It's about feeling a sense of recognition, of finally having a language for a pain that has been so hard to name. The link to the book is in the description below. Also, if you've found this journey valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Billionaire's Bookshelf. Each subscription helps us continue to explore these incredible books together. Our goal here isn't just to summarize ideas, but to build a community of learners who are committed to growth. Let's keep exploring these life-changing ideas together.